everyone. Thank you for joining for another episode of Escape Velocity. Today, we're going to be having a very interesting conversation with Carol Keese. As you know, I've been talking a lot about how higher ed websites all sound the same, look the same. And I think that my guest today is going to have a lot to say about that from a very interesting perspective. So, Carol is VP of University Communications and CMO at the University of Oregon.
Cool.
Before Oregon, she ran brand and marketing at UVA, University of Virginia, and was there through a bicentennial, a new president, a capital campaign. And before higher ed, Carol spent a lot of time working in healthcare and hospital systems. So she was marketing trust in places where trust is really everything at Johns Hopkins Medicine and Children's National. And Carol and I got on each other's radars because she wrote a piece in Inside Higher Ed titled "Higher Education Was Built on Scarcity. That Model is Breaking." And she says that higher ed keeps trying to solve a trust problem with better marketing when the real problem is the model itself. So this caught my attention because we've got a marketer saying that marketing isn't the fix.
Yeah.
I've been looking at this problem from other perspectives for a long time, and she mentioned blanding on her post and got me on her radar. And so we've been talking about having this conversation. So, Carol, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining me, and I'm
Thank
excited
you.
to dive in.
Yeah. Happy to be here.
Um, just a little bit about that article that you wrote for Inside Higher Ed. Was this something that you'd been thinking about for a while? Have you been having conversations internally about, well, fix it with the marketing, and have you been pushing back on that? How did you lead up to that article?
Yeah, I think that was really the result of about, a year and a half, 2 years, really since the conversations about in higher ed were accelerated by the federal administration coming in and what we needed to do to kind of regain trust with consumers and the public. Gallup and Pew and others have been tracking the loss of confidence in all institutions, including higher ed, but higher ed has fallen the farthest the fastest. And so there've been a lot of uh, well-intentioned and important work, but it has been focused on the messaging. How do we get Americans to understand the value of research institutions? How do we get Americans to understand the value of a degree, right? But all of those have essentially focused on messaging. And I was interested in exploring why the messaging hadn't really tracked with the feedback from the market over the last probably 10, 15, 20 years. Most aggressively or most clearly in the last 10 years as consumers became more and more concerned about the price point. And we continue to say things like, sort of the old MasterCard, like priceless, like it's just priceless. Like it's just, we were talking about $250,000 investment. And we were really struggling, I felt, to justify the cost with language that most people could understand, or to rethink how the product was designed and priced so that it better met what the market was telling us. And instead, what I saw was messaging around how we talk. And unfortunately, when we talk in ways that feel tone deaf, we just sort of exacerbate the idea, or we amplify the idea that higher ed is out of touch. And that really concerned me. I've given my career to higher ed in various forms. And so I'm a higher ed advocate. I want to say that as a bit of a caveat, because I am also pretty critical of what we have failed to do in the last couple of decades to be ready for this moment. I think what we're seeing is a confluence of factors, not a single one, that for which we were really unprepared. Yeah. And the fix is not better marketing.
Yeah, it's not better marketing, but it is better trust.
Yeah.
So I was just curious to kind of lean in on that idea of trust. And, I remember not that long ago where almost every higher ed website would hide tuition. You couldn't even find where the cost information was, or they'd bury it under
And
financial aid, you
to this
know.
day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Which to me is and if we go to healthcare, where there's also a big issue with trust
True.
around cost, and everyone is petrified of, the cost and the way insurance works or doesn't work, the cost for insurance. Do you think healthcare is doing things right where higher ed isn't? Or do you
My
see
gosh.
any? Yeah.
They're both broken in different ways. I think higher ed needs to look at its product differently and be more responsive to the market. I think that healthcare, um, you know, we've decided that medicine should be sort of arbitrated by insurance as a society, and that has consequences that are really hitting consumers, and frankly those who practice medicine in the space. What I think is different is that in medicine your outcomes are more immediate, right? You can't prestige signal in the same way that higher ed can, and kind of to get away with it and be divorced from outcomes in the same way because they're so much sooner, right? So your quality metrics, the number of surgeries that you perform, um, the success rate of a certain procedure, those are all public and they're all pretty current. And so they inform a population that has a choice about where to direct their care most of the time, even when arbitrated by insurance. And so that sort of cycle of outcomes to marketing, to positioning, right, to revenue is pretty tight. In higher education, those lead times are enormous, right? We're talking about a once in a lifetime purchase. It's, somewhere around a couple 100,000 to 250,000, depending on where you are going. And that decision is often a 2, 3 year lead up, and the outcomes are a 5 year lag. And so I think that provides kind of a buffer for universities to um, continue to address messaging rather than looking at the product and the outcomes themselves, for more concrete proof. And that's what consumers are increasingly asking for.
So outcomes and proof. I know that, there's this lag time. There's not always great resources for these schools to stay in touch with their alumni and find out, what is actually going on. So how much of it is just lack of research that the schools themselves, whether it's through their own resources or just that they haven't paid close enough attention to tracking the data to really understand how their alumni have done?
I think that's an important component. So I think that there are challenges with that data, like the first destination survey is voluntary, right? Like, could we just make it a requirement of getting your diploma? Like, that would be relatively easy for all of us to do. So I think we do bear some responsibility for making sure that we have access to accurate data about that because we are being asked by the administration and by parents and students to demonstrate that ROI. So I think that we can't just sit back and say, "Oh, data's messy. Like let's fix that." But I also think that there's this convergence of, we've heard this paradox of, when an unstoppable force hits an immovable object. So that was cited a lot in the World Cup, particularly in the Spain v Argentina final,
Yes.
right? I had to look up like where did this come from? So apparently it's an ancient Chinese derivative. Anyway, is an interesting and true, I think, analog to higher education, which remind ourselves is 1,000 years old. And it was designed for permanence, right? It was designed to study the world, but not really be a part of that world. And it was designed for the elite. We could talk about that as part of the prestige and scarcity model. It was never really designed for scale, at least the 4 year residential model, right? And so that kind of immovable object is hitting this unstoppable force, which is the renegotiation of sort of economic, geopolitical, market forces, that, of course, now with AI are being accelerated, but certainly aren't just AI, that are now so prevalent and so formative in what American families are experiencing that it just doesn't have enough intersection with the older value proposition that higher ed was literally designed 1,000 years ago to deliver. And that's where we're sitting. And so it's product design, it's pricing, it's responsiveness, but it's also this thing that was designed to be more or less eternal. Like how do you reconcile those two things? I think it's a really interesting problem that I don't see enough institutions interested in digging into. Instead, the sort of the easier avenue is messaging, um, which I think for the actual elite institutions is probably enough. They have enough brand equity and they have enough ROI and there's enough demand there that they're fine. I think it's really everybody else that's not in the top 50 or top 75 that really needs to rethink what we're doing.
Do you see that starting to happen, or do you feel like it's gonna be a little bit of a,
Bumpy ride.
yeah, bumpy ride
Yeah.
until,
Yeah. I think it's a bumpy ride for two reasons. I mean, number one, I mean, you're seeing it some on the edges and there's not one answer to this, right? And that's a good thing. There's sort of a many sort of multiple paths that universities can take, and that again, that's a good thing because the market is in different places. There should be demand across different kinds of educational experiences. So you're seeing like the Vanderbilts of the world and the Northeasterns do more in person by creating campuses in other markets in New York and other kinds of places. So you're seeing that investment in capital and building that out. And then, of course, we have the Arizona State Starbucks model where you're seeing massive number of students access university credentials through this partnership. My future daughter-in-law being one of them, right? So you have this amazing, this huge and affordable access point to hundreds of thousands of people. So those are two, but those are not new, and there haven't been universities that really replicated the Arizona State model for reasons. Maybe you just need one critical partnership, and that's not replicatable. But I think that there's these two things. But I also think that we have to acknowledge the cost of rethinking the whole structure is enormous. It's enormous. Um, Everything from the way we have tenured professors that have, that are have a lifetime's work protected by that structure
yeah,
to how universities actually make business decisions, which is often in a matrix organization. This is true of healthcare too, somewhere negotiated between the provost and the academic councils and the president CFO structures, that it's very negotiated. There's no one really responsible for, like, let's develop a couple pilots that might explore new business models or even new revenue generation. Certainly less so at the state publics than at the private institutions. And I can't speak for privates because I have not been in them, but I'm surprised there isn't more piloting at least to be like, let's just put a pilot out there and see what happens. I think we're well past time when we should be doing that, all of us, publics and privates.
I'm curious that, you made this transition from UVA to Oregon.
Mhm.
So what was that switch like in terms of how operationalized things, when you talk about a pilot, is that something that you feel a place like Oregon would be more receptive to as a public, or is it
Well,
is it
they're both publics. They're both publics. I think, we talk about, and I don't think I said this in the higher ed piece, but talk about public education and education, higher education being kind of this monolith when it's made up of very different kinds of institutions and very different kinds of environments. So I'll give you Oregon as an example. So we are a member of the AAU. We're an R1 major research university, and we're in a state that is 46 out of 50 for supportive education, all education. That's K through 12. They come first, and then there's all of the university systems, of which the University of Oregon comes last. And so that is not comparable to many other states, including Virginia, that invest, I'd say more wisely, but certainly more substantially in education. And so even when you say public four-year research universities, you're talking about very different dynamics around the resources available to do things like piloting or taking any resources out of like the main structure that exists and putting it into an area that can take risks, which is something that corporate does all the time. Like they might create a separate arm of the institution to say, we're going to give you this sort of this timeline and this budget. We want you to assume the risk while we run the main operations so that we don't lose market share, but like have an exploratory space. Higher ed has some real constraints around how it does that. So even though I'm saying we should be doing that, I also acknowledge that there are financial and structural barriers to that that might be higher at a place like University of Oregon than a place like the University of Virginia. And you take those two things and you just multiply them and four directions, and you get this very different setup for the appetite, the capability, and the resources available to do that kind of work.
Yeah. So in terms of the model itself needing to be rethought, reimagined, maybe expanded so that there are different kinds of models available. Um, and yes, there are some very real constraints to that happening and at speed and a lot of different reasons why, whether it's financial or resources or just tradition and appetite of the school itself to doing things like that. When it comes to marketing and brand, which
Hmm.
is where you and I both focus a lot of our attention, where we've got to work with the model that we have. Where do you think that this intersection between the marketing, the prestige marketing, the scarcity signaling, still kind of playing that game, which will work for the most prestigious, right, and the ones with the name out there already that don't have to worry as much. But where is this? n- Why is this also still remaining the case with schools that they aren't highly selective? They are a better choice, for certain kinds of students, but they're still kind of pandering to
Yeah. Yeah.
this blandness, as I call it, but
Yeah.
it's signaling, they wanna look like everyone
Yeah.
who's above them.
Yeah. I mean, all kinds of things play a part in that. One is just the structure was always designed for the elite. I mean, if you go back 1,000 years, it was designed literally as, originally part of the church, and then for the sort of the second sons of the aristocracy, they're like weren't the inheritors to the throne. And you fast forward, and until really the 30s, it was still reserved for a fairly elite group and was not essentially redesigned when the GI Bill and when the SATs, sort of broke it open. And it never really scaled enough to handle kind of the growth of the population. And I think there is still structure. There's still days when I remind myself I'm working in a 1,000-year-old, structure. And I love so much about that, but there are some real structural constraints to that. So I think what happened is what you're describing. I think what you described in the blanding piece, which was so accurate, is when scarcity and prestige become the proxy for value and ROI, you run into you take some risks with that. One is that you start to sound like everybody else, because everybody else is doing the same thing. So human psychology also plays into that. We want to be aspirational. We can't afford the Chanel bag, but maybe we can get a scarf. Maybe we can like get on, the real or whatever, and like pick up some. We are wired to kind of want the aspirational prestige thing. So it has worked for a really long time. It stopped working when the economics stopped working. And what I mean by that is that the price tag for higher ed has gone up and up and up. And part of that is the disinvestment at the state level and to some degree the federal level too. So the price tag has gotten much, much higher. Consumers, students are paying more than double percentage wise what they paid in 1970. So of course they're asking questions like, number one, they're seeking prestige because they want to make sure that they're buying the highest value product possible. But increasingly now they're asking what the trade-off is for that and what the ROI is for that. And instead of answering that question, sort of the aspirational or near peer organizations continue to sort of lean into that prestige thing that worked for so long. And because of human psychology, the trick is like right now it's not only not working, it sounds tone deaf to the real concerns as people grapple with uncertainty about the economy, uncertainty about the future, much of which has to do with AI, but not just AI, also geopolitics. And they're asking the same questions, and we continue to revert to the same language, which just makes us sound more out of touch with people. And I think what's going to happen, and what actually is happening, is that you have this F-shaped, we talk about K-shaped economy, like where you've got the top of the earners doing just fine, and everybody else is kind of on the slow scale. I think there might be something like an F or an E-shaped economy happening in higher ed, where the true prestige brands that don't have to signal because they are the signal, they'll be fine. The top 50, the top 75 or 100, I don't know where that line is, but it's somewhere. They 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 can keep doing what they're doing because the brand equity is so high, the demand is so high that they can do that. Then there are kind of the near peer, because the selectivity is so high at those very high prestige organizations that they're not going to accept but a fraction of the students that apply. So then you have a second layer of near and aspirational organizations that can charge a premium. And this is what Scott Galloway was talking to, because they're basically arbitrage down to this next layer that needs to be, you know, high status enough for these students, but may not have as much pressure to demonstrate the actual outcomes. And then you have the stem of the F, which is more or less everybody else at the moment, which is you're somewhere along that long tail, unless we rethink how the product works, how it's delivered, how it's priced. That's what we're going to end up. And that's not certainly what I want to see, as someone who's been somewhere in higher education for the last 35 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the well, a bunch of things in there, but one of the things I always wonder about is if you're showing outcomes, if you're sharing results, or you're extrapolating data and saying, we're going to make an average here, assumption. I feel like everyone's scared of, like, well, if we say that people who graduate from this department are likely to get jobs within the first year in this salary range, but not everybody. And
Mhm.
also then, well, what about that other department that we don't want them to be angry and upset that we're not talking about them, but it's maybe it's the the theater department or
Yeah.
the fine
Yeah.
arts department
Yeah,
where,
or
you
or
know,
French, or yeah, and
yeah,
this
like,
is where the humanities field depends, but very understandably so. And I will say that as an English major,
yeah,
I have found my humanities degree immensely helpful, because it turns out, like, no matter what you do, you have to communicate well. So
yes.
there is that. Um, I, I I think that's real, and I think it's not enough of an excuse to say we're just going to go silent, because our silence is also communicating that we ourselves are unsure of the value proposition, and that's a dangerous place to be. When your price tag is where it is, and where it's a 4-year commitment, and when we've been telling people that this is the access point to successful careers or meaningful lives of contribution, for some people, networks of access to, financial networks, social networks, all of that, all of those things that, all of us want for our children, and go into, spoken or unspoken, go into the decision about where we send our kids to college and where they want to go to college. I'm actually encouraged that younger generations are asking more thoughtful and direct questions about the connection between careers and their future and the college degree, and not just going to the prestige place that their parents want to go to. And that's always been a both and, but I think there's more conversation now happening, which I think is really healthy.
Yeah, and I think the conversation around even what is a liberal arts degree worth? And being someone who got a bachelor's of fine arts, I definitely understand that some of these things are hard. You can't necessarily track it to an immediate job in an immediate. It's like, oh, these people will get jobs in finance within the first year, or they'll go on um, to go into law school or med school or whatever the next steps are that you might be tracking. That gets a lot harder
Yeah.
to do in a with a liberal arts environment or degree, where it is sort of like you're gaining a lot of life skills that can be applicable to a lot of different careers,
Yes.
um, versus like a trade school, which is, it's always like, well, there we can show we train people for a certain trade, and then they're placed into that profession, and this is the salary, and it's kind of apples to apples. It's easy to show the comparisons, um, or the attributions or the value. Now, along the same lines, you work in marketing and brand, which is also often seen as a cost center because it's not
Yeah.
easy to show.
Yeah.
We made this many widgets and we sold this many at this price point. So I think there's some similarities there in how we're trying to connect dots for people in terms of value. And I'm just curious, from the inside, in validating the work that you and your teams have done over your career when it comes to marketing and brand. Have you found more effective ways to try to explain value?
So the two organizations that I've worked for most meaningfully in this regard are completely different. So I'm going to just sort of come back to it in terms of how brand messaging can escape, the brand dynamics, and more we can talk about that differences between UVA and Oregon. I think at Oregon we're really thinking about, certainly in the digital space, how to create pathways. We're not a vocational school. Like higher ed should not be a vocational school. And you know, for all the congressional pushback, appropriate or not, on sort of our price point and our value prop and outcomes and all that stuff. Like I don't see a lot of Congress people putting their kids in vocational schools. It's like not, nothing against vocational schools. In fact, I think we should have more of them. But and right, we should be doing the hard work of showing and illustrating how pathways, what those pathways are, how a liberal arts degree sets you up for different kinds of pathways, including graduate school, including law school, including some cases medical school, right? Including graduate work in other ways, including professional work across many industries. And that's where the critical thinking comes in. But like we can actually should be able to reverse the data to say, of all the people in Congress or in or in government, elected officials across the United States, or people in the State Department, or people in finance and policy, like how many of them have liberal arts degrees? A very significant percentage, right? So I don't have the data right at my fingertips, but we can get it. So we should be doing more work to actually illustrate those pathways all the way through. That's one thing. Second, there will always be people who go, thank goodness, will go into education and higher education for its own sake, right? Researchers, scholars. Like, I hope that never stops. Like, that needs to be continue to be, and we need to continue to offer spaces for inquiry for its own sake. And that's very important to the world. It's where new knowledge is born, it's where new research happens. It's also just important as a human endeavor, but not everybody is going to go that path. And so to say everyone has to be in the same model that creates a PhD in philosophy is unrealistic. So it doesn't mean the model is broken for that avenue. It means that we can better support a multiplicity of pathways. We just haven't done enough work to show that that works and then to create product design that actually lives that out. So in fine arts or in something that's applied, could we partner with community colleges? Could we partner with museums to have some of the core curricular with the best faculty in the world teaching on some of the essential courses and having some of the hands-on or practicums done at a local level? So you don't force everyone into this very beautiful but expensive model where it's a residential 4-year experience followed by 2 years of master's followed by 6 more years of PhD. So, God bless that. I hope it never goes away. But we've tried to scale a model that there has too many barriers for the modern world, including cost, but also including time, right? Stop your life for 4 years. Come over here, do this thing, uncertain outcome. There's a lot in there. I hope I answered the question.
Well, it was a
There's a lot.
I think
There's a lot
it
of
was a meaning,
opportunity
yeah,
in
I
there.
think that my question had like 5 in it, and, I think
Yeah.
you I think you touched upon all of them.
Okay.
Um, and it's a perfect segue to talking about AI. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
y I'm noticing, uh, it's adding to what was already there, which was this, like, we've gotta speed up, we've gotta go faster. Now we've got AI, which is changing so fast and becoming so ever present, and there's all the pearl clutching about it's going to take all the jobs and it's going to turn us into, illiterate um, consumption creatures living off of our universal income that OpenAI or Claude or Anthropic
Here.
will give us.
Literally the age, and this is backwards, the age of reading is over as the cover story in the Atlantic. So I hadn't heard the word pearl clutching and AI in the same sentence, but yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. You know,
Yes. Well, I mean, because I think it's reading was already kind of becoming something that I'm like, you're proud to share that you don't read, you just don't like to read. Um, I started to hear more and more people kind of just say, "Oh, I don't read." I'm like, "How can you not read. And then it's like, well, then you can't expect those people to write anything for you. But to me, just there was already an appetite for something to kind of come in and like do all the thinking. And now we've got AI, which very confidently proposes lots of very sure sounding answers to things, which aren't always accurate. But it does it's removing a lot of critical human skills from the plate of in a way that I think is very troubling. So I'm that's a very loaded question. Lead in, which is, how are you seeing AI impact the higher education space in terms of, I mean, everything from how you're operating to how you're seeing the concerns of the incoming students who are facing down this very unknown future.
So I think smarter minds than me are going to grapple with kind of where AI lands in the academic space and the teaching and the pedagogy and the transference of knowledge and creation of new knowledge and all that. I don't know the answer to that. I think a lot of people are worried about it. I'm tangentially worried about it too. I think we do tend to paint AI as one thing when it is a 16 different categories. So it's how AI is or could reshape the academy and the transference of knowledge and what a degree even means and where human knowledge resides, right? But it's also generative AI. What happens to human creativity? What happens to human expression, right? And then what happens to like the rights of artists and all of like there's that. Where we've been focused at Oregon is how AI is shaping and changing the marketing communication space. So for our own division, we've put a lot of work into creating our own AI principles document for our own team so that they feel safe and encouraged to explore, ideate, uh, practice, fail, like fool around with, but also figure out where the value add actually is without fear of, punishment or whatever, right? We also have some rules about nothing nothing happens without human review, right? So just some obvious things like that. But we spent a lot of time and we got having a lot of good conversation from people that brought a lot of the concerns that you're talking about to the fore, including the environmental impact. And we had really robust discussions. I think that we wouldn't be in the space as effectively if we hadn't had a bit of a town hall and an open discussion where like everything, there's no stupid questions because reality is like nobody really knows where this is going to end up, right? So that's one. The second is I think we need to understand that we will be in an AI mediated environment on everything. At least that certainly looks like the way it's going. We need to be prepared for that. That's not just the choice about where you go to college. It's also planning your next vacation. It's also buying the pair of shoes. It's also everything else. And the AI platform you're using also knows everything about you. So it's going to offer, it's the only technology that will confidently offer cross-channel, cross-competitor suggestions. It will reinforce what you've already done. So it will understand your buying habits, which makes it both potentially like deeply exploitative, but also deeply insightful. That's problematic. So we are rethinking our content environment with AI as the first reader. I wish I could say that this was like totally my design, but there are times when you just circle a thing and call it strategy. This is what this is. So we were building a new enterprise site because ours was really outdated, and we started the first work on it a little over a year ago, and with the skill of really talented AVP Brian Hawkins for digital strategy, realized that like AI is the first consumer of all of this content. So we are building to the technology today. So we'll be launching that in, I don't know, 6 weeks or so. So we had the good fortune of coming in at the right time instead of retrofitting an existing site. We're actually building to the moment, and that's luck. It's also just good insight on his part. But we are embracing that as uncomfortable as it is. Our AI is now our first campus visit, and our website is the second campus visit. And we know that if we can get them to our campus, we have them. But we have to navigate those two things first, and that's the funnel. That's just where it moved. It's not a different dynamic. It's just a different placement, and that's where marketers need to lean in rather than resisting.
So I'd love to dig in on this because I'm sure a lot of people that will listen, you know, are curious about what does that look like to really, so many people are looking at their sites, and they know that they need to be communicating better to the AIs, um, because that is there are a lot of people who are going to get all their information from
Yeah,
these systems and never end up on the website or
right.
way down the process, but at some point they will. And so, you can't disregard the website. But I'm really curious to have there been 3 or 4 things that you've really approached differently, having the luxury of redoing it at this
Mhm.
time, with the support behind you to really make sure that you're thinking it through from the right directions?
Yeah, I mean, I think from sort of website content, we were told for years that longer narrative sections in terms of content, longer narrative writing was the thing, and not to do FAQs. And the exact opposite is now true. So AI wants, digestible bits in response to real and hypothetical questions, because that's how it is a different kind of engine. It is still an answer engine. So you need to feed it answers. And this could be a great accelerant to us also figuring out a different way to the value proposition, where we talk about pathways, right? Where we meet students who, like, let's be honest, at 17 aren't really clear what they're going to do, but they want to see a pathway. They want to see like a trail. And we can do a better job in that content and through functions like FAQs or intuitive AI driven journeys on our sites. Like, what are you looking for? It's like, I want something in the arts. Okay, let's take you, like let's show you the programs, forget about the school they're in. Like, let's just show you programs that are here and where those things tend to lead in terms of careers. So we actually let's reveal that in a different way. Nobody cares how we're organized. Like, really, nobody cares how we're organized. And whether, the data analytics program for sport, it lives in the business school or lives in arts and sciences or lives in somewhere else, it doesn't matter to the outside world. So this is just accelerating our fluency with meeting people where they are. And I think sounds super corny, but it's also really true. Like, market is the first word in marketing. Like, we are supposed to be, right? Like, remember that? We are supposed to be and represent the voice of the consumer and the voice of the market and the data from the market that should be informing how we're talking about the product and, hopefully down the road, how we're designing and pricing. Oh, one other thing. As AI looks more to earned media. So as news outlets become a much more important source of credibility for AI engines, we have done a lot of work in our earned media strategy and do a lot more national pitching and a lot more effort around that. We're also rethinking our own content, but I think earned content is really becoming a key component of making sure that because it will look for quantifiable sources. So the signaling that we've all been doing with narrative and storytelling now needs to be quantifiable, verifiable, and consistent. And that means it can't just be your platform. So you have to do more work.
Yeah, and look at more platforms and pay
Right.
attention. I think, there have been a lot of many years where it's preferable to kinda stick your head in the sand versus worry about what's being said on Reddit about certain programs or whatever, as well as putting the emphasis right on the earned media. So a lot of that can be, hard to reach for a school that maybe doesn't have the rankings or the recognition coming out, to kind of tout or the numbers. But where do they look to when they are looking to get more media to back? Is it faculty? Is it
Yeah,
um,
it could
you know,
be. I mean, rarely is earned media all that interested in who's number one this year in like US news, right? Like they're just like it's always ends up being the same 10 people, right? The same institutions. So that's not a news story. I think that the job for higher ed is also to become more relevant. Like, we need to be more in the spaces where people are living their lives. So that means that we need to be thinking about both paid and earned differently. Because they're going to say like higher ed is disconnected and they're like over in the ivory towers because we kind of are. Like, we advertise in the Chronicle and God bless the Chronicle, but like we're talking to ourselves, right? So We're not on the Hallmark Channel. We're not on Spotify as much as we should be. We're not in these, we're not sponsoring things that could be a co-branding opportunity with a consumer brand. That, again, not every organization can do that, but every organization has opportunity, different set of opportunities. Oregon, we did a very successful collab with Nike and with the Grateful Dead about a year ago on Grateful Ducks, and it got national attention. It was in PR Week, Move of the Week. It was covered in GQ and Rolling Stone. Like, we have that because we have the history of the Grateful Dead in Eugene at the University of Oregon. So it was part of our sort of authenticity and narrative. And the greatest, one of the greatest consumer brands ever, Nike, was part of that. So, and of course, Nike born at the University of Oregon. So we had this confluence of stuff that was sort of cultural relevance that people cared about and were delighted by. So I'd love to see higher ed. Dartmouth has its thing. UVA, like, we all have a thing or a couple things. We need to continue. We need to think differently about what those threads that intersect with music, culture, sport, or just what's happening in the news cycle.
Yeah.
Every university in this country can put an expert into the news cycle to talk about wildfires or talk about the economy or talk about um, any one of a number of things. Like, that's what we do. We're in a thought leadership space. So we need to act more, I think, like consumer brands and get our people out there in the spaces where people are digesting news, commenting on it, interested in the topic. Um, yeah, we shouldn't wall ourselves off.
Yeah, I agree. How much of that do you think is a symptom of higher ed in general not wanting to treat itself like
Mm,
a business per se? And I've said many times that I was always shocked how reluctant, especially, going back 20 years, to use the word brand
oh my God, no.
when you were
Right.
talking to a higher ed potential client. Was just, no, we're not going to use that. It was like a dirty word. Marketing was seen as a dirty word. That was all seen as like, that's big business. That's for profit,
Corporate.
right?
Right. Yeah. It's complicated. It's
Yeah.
complicated. I think, and I saw this 30 years ago in medicine. Some of the same day, we don't need to advertise or market because we're us, right? And I watched that sort of light bulb go off in medicine, even in academic medicine, realize like the markets are actually very competitive. And that competition forces those organizations now to be much more proactive in predictive analytics and understanding like what their position is relative to competitors offering same or similar services. It's still a service model. And again, the cycles are fast, right? They're not once in a lifetime purchase. They could be purchasers, especially for women who make the medical decisions in their household. They've got, maybe 4 people, 5 people that they're making decisions for, and they can move across town almost any moment. Um, so there's that. I think that higher education has followed medicine, realizing in the last certainly 10 years that um, it can't just, it's us, so it doesn't need anything. Um, I think even the prestige brands realize, and that, having been at UVA, the task there was really to professionalize the marketing function for a legacy brand, which had its own challenges, and to get it into the market in ways that had not been in the market, so that you're either spending down that brand equity or you're adding to it. You're never static. For Oregon, it was really better defining what the value proposition is and leading into spaces where people are living their lives and being more relevant culturally and in other ways, leading into our own areas of differentiation, which makes us not bland but specific.
Yeah.
So the challenge is different in different places. I would like to see higher education, and even with the strength of the business schools that we have, do more to bring that knowledge to the actual problems that higher education is facing and not be on the outside looking in, but to also apply that immense body of knowledge and skill to the challenges of how do we design the product, or to create more pathways into the product, or more kinds of products, layered products, where you still have the PhD that's going to go into knowledge for its own sake, but you also have access points in that meet people where they are. And
Yeah.
I hope that's happening more than. more than I'm seeing it, and I hope it will happen.
I hope so too, and I think even you're using the word product when you talk about
Yeah,
the challenge, you know, you use the word market, you use the word product. I agree differentiation is critical, and the best way to do that is to tell specific stories, to be specific about and even to be okay saying, "Here are some pathways that we can validate as likely pathways that a graduate from this program may experience in their life, but we don't necessarily know the pathways coming out of this one yet.
yeah.
But we're not going to hold off on sharing these things until we've got everything democratically spread out, you know."
It's never you're never standing still. You're always moving, and it's a great case in point that ethics is now so important for AI. Like, all of a sudden, ethicists and philosophers, like, are in higher demand because as AI, right? Like, it's just like the irony and the beauty of that. Like, as AI takes, becomes a force in its own right, like, what is human and what human discretion is and what ethics are becomes much more important, which is fascinating and interesting, and I'm glad to see that, right? So how can we move into spaces where the human judgment and human creation become actually more valuable? Um, Universities, I hope, are providing ethicists and philosophers into that space, but we that's the kind of questions that universities are great at debating and discussing, and
Yeah,
hopefully producing people who bring that.
I think in a world of AI, we need the liberal arts
Yes,
educated thinker
we do.
more than a lot of other kinds of thinkers, um, assuming that we remain in control of what we do with the AI. And you know, there's all sorts of conversations about super intelligent AI where it becomes smarter than humans, but this ethics, morality, you know, questioning idea is how does an AI ever reach that when it's really just been trained on everything that's come before on the internet for the most part, where we don't always see our best and brightest thinking on full display.
You don't think?
Um, so yeah, I mean, it's concerning, depending on how it goes, where it goes. But I think with so much uncertainty in what the next few years will look like, it must be a hard place for especially a higher ed to be in because no one's really sure where it's going to go.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and the same can be said for many other industries from that perspective. I think nobody is sure where it's going to go. But I think to kind of wrap your last thought, higher education has always been deeply invested in what it is to be human and um, what it is to be, conscious and sentient and to examine the world and to approach the world through curiosity and inquiry. That's what we do. And this moment demands all of that. And the uncertainty surrounding it actually just makes it more important that we employ those tools the higher ed was created to support um, and disseminate.
Amen to that. That is very, very true. um, well, as we kind of wrap up on our session here, is there anything else? You know, I had a lot of questions that I thought we could dig into, and I think we've dug into some of them. But is there anything else that you think you know a listener would be better off having heard than not from your perspective right now? Let's assume that this is someone who is sitting in a similar seat, trying to make sense out of this within their own team, within their own institution, grappling with very, you know, in a situation where you can't necessarily remake the model right now.
Yeah,
It's the model that you've got.
yeah,
How can
yeah,
they be doing a better job getting the getting past all of this surface stuff that I think is not doing anybody any good.
be
It's
good. Yeah,
not connecting the right students who need the kind of education that these schools offer. How do they save themselves and do a better job and
yeah.
compete?
I think there's a probably a immediate midterm, like long term thing. I think the immediate thing is like accept the fact that AI is going to mediate everything you do. And that just is. You can argue if it's a good thing or a bad thing, it just is. So rethink your balance of your portfolio, earned media to owned content, how that owned content is structured, how your website content needs to be rethought, all of those things. Like make yourself visible. If you don't do that, you're invisible. So like that's just brings fees for at this point for universities to be seen. I think we sometimes forget, especially in light of the Gallup and, all the other confidence indicators that we've been staring at, for the last couple of years, we forget that there is demand. There's still, even today, like a lot of demand for the product that we have, and there's a lot of students who have stopped out that would like to complete their degree. Um, and so uh, we need to answer that demand and we need to lean into it as much as we can sort of have these existential conversations. There are people today, right now, who would like to have better access and information about what we offer them. So we need to respond to that. And I think the third thing is, there was been a lot of talk over the last decade, 5 years or so about marketing having a seat at the table. And I'm delighted to see that a lot of CMOs now exist and are reporting to the president. That's as it should be. It's a business function. It's a strategy. It's a fulfillment on your strategy. It's a business strategy function. So it's that's important and it's great. That said, um, it's not about getting the seat. It's what you did to get it, and it's what you do when you have it. Because if we don't move on the opportunity we've been given, we will lose that seat, and the institutions and the industry, the sector will miss a huge opportunity. That means we have to make the hard choices and we have to ask the hard questions. And, the unpopular questions, including the questions about design and pricing of our product, even though that's not traditionally in my portfolio. If no one is raising those questions, again, market being the first word in marketing, who's doing that? So that I think is really our obligation and some of the best service that we can provide to our institutions right now.
What do you think if you could say just stop talking about these things, they don't matter?
Mm.
Are there any top of
Yeah,
mind things,
yeah,
vanity metric, whatever it might
yeah. Get
be
over the
that
rankings. They are what they are. They're a proxy for quality and all kinds of other things, and people will use them. So like they're going to exist forever, whether it's US News or something else. It's how we make decisions. Like get over that. Get over the idea that communications can do anything to change the rankings. Like please get over that. Um, I think it's not that it's not important. It's just that rankings is an outcome of what you are already doing. It's a lagging indicator. So if you're doing all the things right, you'll see it reflected in the rankings. And by the way, they're a 3-year rolling average, so it's going to be a while. So like everybody sit down. So like just that one. I think sentiment is really important, and I think real time sentiment. So we do perception studies, done perception studies at UVA in Oregon. They're terribly important, but they're typically once a year or twice a year. We need those paired with real-time AI enhanced sentiment analysis so we really understand where our brand sits because you're only ever participating in the brand, you never control it. So I think with the news cycle being the speed that it is, with decision making being as informed by earned media and AI as it is, we really, really need to understand sentiment and reputation in real time. Those are leading indicators. Rankings, just, they're old. They're old. And if you're doing the right things anyway, you'll see it show up. And if you're not, then that's your problem, not your rankings. So I'd like to see more emphasis put on understanding sentiment in real time. Yeah. And
wow.
engagement.
Yeah. And engagement, where do you measure engagement?
We measure it pretty much everywhere. We measure it on content. We measure it certainly in social a lot. We measure it on our site differently. Well, our new site's going up in shortly, so that will be different. But how sticky are you? How do people want to interact with you? Are you bringing people? Let's not forget, like delighting people is a great marketing strategy, and I think higher ed needs to like get a little lighter, you know, get a little bit more like funny and interesting, and like a little less pompous. And we have it. We have all kinds of things that we can put into that space. We just aren't in the habit of doing that because we're not in the habit of meeting people where they are and bringing all the parts of our culture and community into those spaces instead of just the prestige ones. Turns out when we do that, people respond. So do more of that.
I agree. I think it's a complicated time, and a complicated set of problems that we're talking about. So I do think that you've given some great words of wisdom to anyone who's listening, and I agree. These are fights that need to be won, and I'm glad there's more seats at the table for people that are thinking about brand and marketing and how we talk about who we are and make meaning out of that and connect with the right people. It's very important. So thanks for coming on and talking about all of these things. And
Delightful.
I will look forward to continuing to read all the things that you write about and keep putting them out there
Likewise.
for anyone listening.
Likewise.
I'll share a link to Carol's LinkedIn and to her article that she wrote recently at Inside Higher Ed. And anything else, Carol, that you want me to share, I'll share all of those
Great.
links.
That's great.
And thanks again.
Thank you. And likewise, I so enjoy reading your pieces, and I will continue to do that. And thank you for the work that you do in this space.
Thank you.